Welcome to Hub History, where we go far beyond the Freedom Trail to share our favorite stories from the history of Boston, the hub of the universe. This is episode 288, A History of Boston, with Dain. Hi, I'm Jake. In just a few minutes, I'm going to be joined by the author of an ambitious new history of Boston, which is called A History of Boston. Back in early 2021, I got an email from a listener who said that his day job was a lawyer, but he'd been working on a manuscript about Boston history for a couple of years. When he sent me a PDF, I was shocked to see that it was a hefty 800 pages, and it followed Boston history from the formation of the continents out of the megacontinent Pangaea right through to the actions of the, at that time, current Walsh administration. We went on to trade a series of favorite Boston history anecdotes over email. He said that he liked the incident where the crew of the USS Constitution had to resort to kedging, or towing the ship, to outrun a British foe during a battle with no wind. I responded that I always chuckle over the time when Captain Stewart ordered the USS Constitution's sails thrown aback, letting the wind catch the front edge of the sails and suddenly stopping the ship, but at the risk of shearing off the mainmast. I joked that it always reminded me of that scene in Top Gun when Maverick says,
"Dudes, I've had about enough of this shit. When it hit the brakes, they'll fly right by."
Imagine my surprise when I got a package in the mail 2 years later with a bound copy of the manuscript. The author had helpfully flagged page 217 with a post-it note. I flipped the page open, and there was my Top Gun joke in a footnote. That author is Dain, who will join me in just a moment to talk about his new book. But before we talk to Dain, I just want to pause and say a big thank you to everyone who supports Hub History on Patreon. Your support allows me to create this show. Your contributions pay for web hosting and security, podcast media hosting, and the processing tools we use to make the show sound better. Over the past couple of months, you've also allowed me to use AI to automatically generate richer show notes for recent episodes. To everyone who already supports the show, thank you. And if you're not yet supporting the show and you'd like to start, it's easy. Just go to patreon.com/hubhistory or visit hubhistory.com and click on the Support Us link. And thanks again to all our new and returning sponsors. I'm joined now by Dain. Dan is the president and co-founder of the boutique law firm Dain, which specializes in real estate and development. He sits on a number of boards, including the board of the Vilna Shul, the historic immigrant synagogue on Beacon Hill that we recently featured in episode 257. He's a true Boston history nerd, and he's an enthusiast of cities more broadly. Dan's new book is A History of Boston, and it blends his interest in urbanism with his deep love of Boston history to relate a series of boom and bust cycles in the long-term health and viability of Boston. I'll ask him not only what's happened in Boston's past, but also what challenges and opportunities he sees on Boston's horizon. Dain, welcome to the show.
This is a great treat for me to be on because I am both a fan of your show as well as you are a great resource to me in writing the book. I was that sort of nerd who listened to your episodes with a pad of paper and pen and took notes.
That is incredibly flattering and also a little bit frightening. Whenever I think of anybody relying on my research, I wince a little bit and hope that they're also backing that up with their own. Let me start listeners off with what the book is. So, Dan, you've written a new book called A History of Boston, and it is a very hefty tome. I will admit, as I was preparing for the interview, I thought, I'll drop the book on the table and just give people a sense of how it weighs in, but that almost destroyed the table my laptop's on. So instead, I'll hold it up and go, it's a very hefty tome. It weighs in at about 770 pages minus index and appendices. And as somebody who does some historical research and tries to put a historical podcast together, I know it's really hard to do history as a side gig. So you must be a history professor, a park ranger, some sort of history professional, right?
So no. I am a trial attorney, and the clients I represent are generally commercial real estate developers and property owners in Boston and Greater Boston. The book was sort of a pairing of my passion for urbanism issues. The book is really an urban studies by using the history of Boston as a case study for discussion and thinking about what makes cities successful, which is really what my passion is. And what it marries is, as a trial attorney for the industry, the way I do my job is I take a series of facts, a set of documents, interview notes, deposition transcripts, and I take a whole bunch of what might be disjointed facts and try to put them into an interesting narrative and tell stories, right? And so the process of telling history is very similar to advocacy of a trial lawyer, which is just tell interesting stories and try to lead your reader to the conclusions you want your reader to draw. So the process of writing the book is actually very similar to what I do every day in my day job.
If you had asked me when I was in high school, I would have never guessed that. Well, first of all, podcasts didn't exist, so I couldn't have guessed that I'd be hosting a history podcast. But just to say that I'd be doing anything around history, I would have been very skeptical, because history in school is, it's names, it's dates, it's when did this battle occur and who took the day. It's really great to see somebody else tackling history as narrative and the story of people. Yeah,
it's a series of short stories that are really, really interesting. And then the challenge for someone who does a book is to then tie them together in some kind of narrative arc that has a thesis essentially, and tell stories that try to back up what is ultimately the conclusion. And so there's a unifying theme to it. And that's part of the challenge, is to make things relevant and relate. And how do you tell all these disparate stories and yet have them have some kind of cohesion? So that's sort of the challenge of it. But people have said to me that they feel intimidated by the length of the book. To a certain extent, I hope people do read it from beginning to end, because there is a sort of an arc to the storytelling. And yet I also say, don't feel compelled to pick it up and think that you have to read it straight through, because it is a series of short stories. And so flip through and pick out the short stories that are interesting. If you're interested in Boston's role in the American Revolution, read those sections. If you're interested in the rise of the Industrial Revolution that really gets its start in Massachusetts, read those sections. If you're interested in James Michael Curley and Boston in the first half of the 20th century, read those sections. So there's no need to read it all at once, I think. And I think it can stand on its own as a series of short stories or as a whole narrative arc.
Well, I can attest that you can dip in and read it as a series of short stories, because the first thing I did when I got a copy of this book in the mail was flip to the page that you had helpfully flagged with a Post-it for me on page 217 to find, unexpectedly, a footnote citing Jake Sconyers. And
because I loved our email exchange that we had a couple of years ago.
And so I reread, or I read a story that I was pretty familiar with about the USS Constitution and
the science.
Thank you. And the moment when the captain lets the wind catch the foredge of the sails, suddenly slamming on the brakes. And the footnote's a joke I made years ago now on the podcast about that being akin to a scene in Top Gun when Maverick drops the flaps so that the plane suddenly decelerates and lets Jester fly by and get in his crosshairs. Probably the best historical joke I'll ever tell.
I started working on this project in December 2017 and was well into it when I was looking for podcasts that were relevant and found yours. So at a certain point a few years ago, I reached out to you and just say, hey, I think your podcast is cool, and I'm trying to write a manuscript. And I think we sort of exchanged, like, what are some cool historical stories?
Yeah.
And you had mentioned that one or one of us mentioned it as one of our favorites, and then you provided the really cool analogy to Top Gun, which I just loved.
Well, that takes me to the question. Obviously you're somebody who's a history nerd like myself, but there has to come a moment when you say to yourself, this might be a book. How did you come to that moment?
Surprisingly, it was well into the project. So I didn't actually intend to write a book, as funny as that sounds. As I said, my passion is urbanism and city building. And so, I do a lot of lecturing and writing on issues of urban planning and urban studies and what makes cities successful. And it all relates to my advocacy work. If I'm going to advocate for a new development in Boston, I need to be able to articulate why, say, a new residential building is good for the city or not. I mean, I always take the side of it's good for the city, but I need to understand the arguments on both sides. And so that's really my area of study. And I spend a lot of time reading books on urbanism and city building. And so what I was puzzling about going back, maybe 10 years or so was when my clients make decisions to invest in the city or build a new building, they're really making a prediction into the future, which is if they build a new building, when the building opens, there's going to be people who still want to live in Boston, who still want to work in Boston. If there'll be companies to lease offices or lab space or warehouse space. This assumption, this prediction into the future is really based on this notion that we've been in this period of the last 30 years that I call high urbanism, which is a period of time that I describe as when people want to live, work, play, study, shop, visit a city, in our case, Boston. But I grew up in Boston in the 1970s and 1980s, and I remember when the best way to describe Boston when I was growing up was a basket case. The city had experienced 70 years of stagnation. In 1950, the U.S. Census, Boston's population was 801,000 people. In 1980, I believe it was 520,000 people. The city lost almost 300,000 people in 3 decades. In the 1980s, the Brookings Institute declared Boston one of the most blighted big cities in the country. I read Ed Glazier is a friend of mine and head of the economics department at Harvard, and he did a study that showed that in the 1980s, 3/4 of all houses in Boston, all homes in Boston, were worth less than the cost of construction. That people were fleeing Boston so much in the 1980s. I mean, we're talking about, just 40 years ago, less than 40 years ago. People were fleeing the city so much that if you built a new house, you couldn't sell it for what you would put into it. So, construction had completely stopped. But I also knew that in the 19th century, Boston was so successful and so many people wanted to be in Boston that to accommodate everyone, we needed to knock the hills around Boston down and do land.
Build in the harbor, yeah.
Back Bay and South End and waterfront. And, South Boston was a small peninsula off of Dorchester. East Boston was a series of islands. And the city was growing so much that there was an annexation movement when the neighboring independent towns of Dorchester and Roxbury and West Roxbury, which at the time included Roslindale and Jamaica Plain, Hyde Park, Charlestown, Alston and Brighton, all were annexed into the city. And the movement really only ends when Brookline said no to annexation. So what I was interested in was this swinging back and forth between periods of success and failure in the city. And so I wanted to understand that better and just started doing research on my own and taking notes. And then the notes got a little bit longer and, I just wanted to have something that I could pull out and refer to, sort of use as a cheat sheet, or if friends of mine came to town, I could give it a quick read before giving a tour of Boston so I could remember some of the stories. And it just got longer and longer. And at a certain point, I said, well, why don't I actually try to finish this as a manuscript and try to see if I can get it published?
Plenty of authors would make a book of its own out of a study of sort of the decline and rebirth of Boston, post-war decline, and then sort of the Boston miracle rebirth in the 80s, the 90s, say. But your book has a much more sweeping scope than that. I believe you start with the volcanic formation of Roxbury Pudding Stone some millions of years ago, and it runs...
I only go back 580 million years ago, yeah. The formation of the Avalon Belt in the Southern Oceans, which was volcanic and slowly drifted north and got smushed between the North American continent and Africa and formed Pangaea. And then when they split apart again, it fused onto the North American continent, and that's the plain that we get between the Appalachian Mountains and the Atlantic coast. But I thought it was important. The reason I start with the geologic history is because, for instance, the landfill that we talk about was only possible because of not going back to the volcanoes, but
to the glaciers,
to the glaciers and the gravel deposits. If you didn't have the gravel deposits, you wouldn't have been able to do the landfill. So I felt it was important to start with the geologic history because it informs the rest of the history, to understand that Boston has a harbor, a natural harbor, that there are rivers. The Charles River is not particularly navigable, which affected the history of the region. But the Merrimack, had a much greater flow, which plays a role in the rise of the Industrial Revolution. And so the geologic and geographic history of the area is relevant to everything that comes after.
Well, besides just the sort of broad sweep of time the book covers, you also define Boston very broadly. At times, the narrative, like you said, takes us from the Merrimack Valley in the north through, Nantucket, or maybe even beyond in the south. At the moment you said, oh, this may be a book, did you realize how broad the scope was going to be?
So defining Boston is really, really challenging. Not just Boston, defining any city. This past summer, my family spent a vacation in Korea and Japan, and we were so intrigued by the mega cities there, Seoul and Tokyo and Osaka, and I was just trying to look up what are the biggest cities by population in the world, and there's not a lot of agreement as to how you define population of a city, and it really relates to when you're defining an urban center. It depends on what parameters you're using, right? So if we're talking about the political boundaries of Boston is tiny. Boston's not that much bigger than the Denver airport. I thought that was a good comparison, right? Like whoa, it's just a single airport. It's like the size of the entire city of Boston if you're talking about political boundaries. But those political boundaries, as we talked about, are just political historical happenstance, right? The housing market, if you're talking about the housing market of Boston, you're talking about southern New Hampshire, almost out to Worcester, even down to parts of Rhode Island is the housing market. If you're talking about the economic market, then you really are talking about all of New England, right? So something like whaling, well, there weren't a lot of whaling ships that were leaving from Boston, but whaling was enormously important to the economy of New England in the 19th century. And the capital for whaling out of Nantucket, New Bedford, was coming from Boston. The mills of New England up in Lowell and all the way into New Hampshire, enormously important to the economy of New England in the 19th century. It's all being, the investors are all coming, investors and banking and everything else is coming out of Boston. So if you're talking about an economic area, you're really looking at a much larger region where Boston is the center. And so it really meant that Boston was essentially effectively the capital of New England. If you want to talk about, and since I tell a social and cultural history, if you want to talk about, where people's, where they recreate, what's recreation for people who live in Boston. And then you're talking about beaches, around New England. You're talking about ski mountains around New England. And so I wanted to tell a little bit of the history of beaches and ski mountains and things like that. So it became a little bit of a challenge to decide what was in and what was out. I wasn't going to tell specifically the history of like Portland, Maine, but to the extent that Portland, Maine relates to Boston. So for instance, what were called the Indian Wars, in what was then called Falmouth, Maine, the fact that Falmouth, Maine was being attacked by French and their Native American allies, the Pennacook and the Abenaki, that was important to understanding Boston because Boston was sending militia up to Maine to defend what was the northern frontier. And Maine, of course, was part of the Massachusetts Bay Colony. So, it becomes difficult as to where to draw the line. And ultimately, I just needed to make some decisions on that.
As a whole, and especially the first chapter of the book, are really a love note to the city of Boston. And, this town isn't as old as Paris. It's not as big as Beijing. It's not home to the automotive industry like Detroit or Hollywood like LA or finance like Manhattan. It doesn't have the beaches of Miami. It doesn't have the mountains of Denver, even though we're about the size of the Denver airport.
Right.
What makes Boston so important on the world stage? What makes it worthy of this treatment?
That's a question I had to ask in doing this book because it was really like, well, why would someone care about the history of Boston? and I drew the conclusion that actually Boston probably does have the most important history of any American city. And, if you go back to the importance to the American narrative of, the arrival of the separatists, the Pilgrims in 1620, and then followed in 1630 by the Puritans, and how that really sets the stage for European colonization in North America, certainly British North America. Through the role of Boston in the American Revolution, the importance of Boston as a center of trade in the colonial period in the early 19th century, and how, North American trade was all essentially run through Boston. Its role in the rise of the Industrial Revolution, its role in the abolition movement, it's the first civil rights movement in American history was in Boston in the 1840s. The rise of the women's rights movement comes out of the abolition movement in Boston. And then Boston becomes a case study of failed urban policies in the 20th century. Almost every federal, state, and local policy in the 20th century was about how to tear a city down and move people to the suburbs, and that was the stated goal of all these policies. And so it becomes an important history in the 20th century because of how these policies failed the city for 7 decades, and the proof was that jobs and people were leaving the city at a high rate for a very long time.
You capture that sort of cyclical, the rise and fall of Boston, the health of any great city, through a series of 5 what you call watershed moments, and they're sort of the central organizing structure of the book. So what's that term mean to you, or what's it mean in the context of the book?
I started off with this notion that Boston had swung between periods of success and failure. And, there's a trap that one who's looking into history can fall into, which is trying to set parameters that are very neat, right? And so obviously these notions of success and failure, Boston was a basket case in the 20th century. Well, it wasn't perfectly a basket case. There were some great periods of success for the city and the region, right? The Massachusetts miracle that I talk a lot about in the book can be understood both as a great success. Massachusetts in the 1980s had the lowest unemployment rate in the country, but also a real failure because it was a suburban phenomenon and it contributed to people and jobs leaving the city. You can fall into a trap of trying to be too specific and say, things flipped and then you have a different narrative. And yet you want to have some organizing principles in order to see larger trends, in order to place yourself in the history in a way that's comprehensible. And so I felt that I needed to have some organizing principles. And I noticed that there were these moments that I call watershed moments, meaning when there was just absolutely major changes in the nature of the Boston area. So I start with the Great Puritan Migration of 1630, which fundamentally changes the nature of New England, right? There already had been the separatists in 1620, and some Puritans were coming over a little bit earlier than 1630, and the Native Americans had been decimated by disease that had been accidentally introduced by French explorers in 1616. But a totally reordering of New England society in 1630 with the Puritans arriving, and then. I think everyone would agree the American Revolution was pretty disruptive of what was before and ushered in something completely different.
Yeah, just a minor moment of global change, sure.
And then the Industrial Revolution fundamentally changes the relationship between, how wealth is created. It goes from a period of wealth really being created out of the land itself, right? The New England economy is so much based on agriculture and fishing and whaling, as well as trade, but the trade products were, a lot of it was based on natural products, to one where, industry is the organizing, economic principle for much of the 19th century. And then by the 1920s, when our manufacturing and industrial economy collapses in the 1920s, we don't reform. And so you go from this period of continual success for Boston, albeit not perfectly, and there's lots of things from the 19th century and early 20th century in Boston that aren't so nice. But overall, if you're talking about success or failures of cities, Boston was highly successful. And then there's really this flip from the 1920s on, and then very, very dramatically changes again by the 1990s, where people are coming back into the city so much. I mentioned that in the 1980s, a house was, not worth the cost of construction. To today, it's unaffordable for anyone other than the extremely wealthy. And not just housing. I mean, we're focused so much on housing, but an average hotel room in Boston is something like $500, and we don't talk about that. But if you're a tourist from anywhere in the world and you want to come to Boston, only the very, very wealthiest can afford to stay in a hotel room in Boston. And that changes the nature of the way people from all around the world relate to Boston.
Years ago, a decade ago now, I was a tour guide in Boston, and my Back Bay tour, I would very pointedly wrap up sort of at the turn of the 20th century, because we're coming out of this period of, Boston in the latter half of the 19th century is just, we're filling in the harbors. We're experimenting with ether and x-rays, where we've got the telegraph and the telephone and electrification, and everything's on the upslope as we head into the 20th century. And then I would just end it there and ignore the decades to come as the long, slow slide into sort of post-war malaise happened.
Back Bay is a great example, right? So Back Bay is one of the great neighborhoods in the world, I
Sure.
think. And it was a home for Yankees really fleeing the arriving Irish in the 1850s, and moving out of downtown to the Back Bay.
Because it was also the moment, the first time you could commute. Commuted fare on the Dedham Railway was the first time that you could really live apart from your place of business, further to walk. And so we had to fill in the Back Bay to keep everybody from fleeing the most desirable Yankee wealthy tax base, at least, from fleeing elsewhere.
And today it's one of the most exclusive neighborhoods in the entire world. But I had lunch recently with Professor Emeritus at Northeastern, Barry Bluestone, who's one of the great urban and economic thinkers in Boston. He's written some books about Boston and very influential thinker on urban issues. And he rented an apartment on Marlborough Street in the 1970s. And he was told when he moved in that part of Back Bay had the highest incidence of theft and robbery of anywhere in Boston. And the first weekend after he moved in, his entire apartment was cleared out by burglars. And it's like, wow, like that was in the 1970s. Marlborough Street in the Back Bay had declined so much that it was like a crime center for Boston.
I'm a transplant to Boston, and one of the things that hooked me on moving here as a kid, I would read novels by Robert B. Parker, who was this sort of hard-boiled detective novelist. But he started writing this series of novels in the mid-'70s, and he was a professor at Northeastern at the time. So a lot of the books at the start of his series in the 70s and early 80s are set in sort of either the Back Bay area or the Fenway area. And it's all, crime-riddled and
gritty.
Yeah, gritty. And it's all multi-million-dollar condos. Every place where a body was found now is just a multi-million-dollar condo in the Back Bay. Showing you how much things have really changed. For now, at least. What I try to do with this show is to find stories that I didn't know, and hopefully our listeners didn't know, and highlight those, because we all know about Paul Revere's ride, but there's so much history and so many people who we don't know about. So what are some of those stories, or some of the people who you came across who are not as well known?
Well, so one of them is the story of the Remonstrance in 1646. Do you know this story? I think it's a really
I don't think I do.
Let me see if I get the story right. So 1646, so we're talking 16 years after the arrival of the Puritans. And the Puritans were notable today for, shall we say, intolerance of other viewpoints. And so, they become famous a little bit later for hanging Quakers, Mary Dyer. But one of their first groups that they did religious battle with were the Presbyterians, those crazy Presbyterians. And the Presbyterians were not allowed to vote in Boston, and were not allowed to take communion in the churches of Boston. And so there were Presbyterians in Boston, and they were upset about this. And they petitioned the General Court, which is the legislative body in Massachusetts, for the right to vote and the right to take communion. And the document that they submitted was called the Remonstrance and Petition. And the threat was that if you don't grant us these rights, we're gonna we're going to take the remonstrance and petition to Parliament. And these were fighting words to the Puritans because they had the Massachusetts Bay Charter, which was essentially self-governing out of Massachusetts, and they did not appreciate the notion that one could petition Parliament to overrule their edicts.
That may have come to a head about 130 years later or so.
A little bit, right? These issues continue to come up throughout the entire Puritan and colonial period. So the General Court has John Winthrop, the governor, write a response, which they call the Declaration. And, being the free thinker that John Winthrop was, he basically said, well, you got two choices. You can become free men of the churches of Boston, in other words, the Puritan church, or Rhode Island's very attractive. So, think about Rhode Island. It's really quite nice. And to top it off, the General Court fined each of the signers of the remonstrance and petition up to £50 each, which was an enormous amount of money in 1646. So this was not the response the group of Presbyterians were hoping for. And so they booked passage on the ship, the Supply, it was called, to go to England with the petition. And the Puritans found out that, or believed that as all these Presbyterians were getting ready to sail for England, they boarded the ship and searched all throughout the ship looking to see if the petition was on it. And they found the petition. They took the petition off. But they were nervous that maybe there was another copy. And so they had the famous minister John Cotton give a sermon. And what sermon did he choose but the story of Jonah and the whale as a lesson to any Presbyterians who might be thinking about, going and pressing their case before the British Parliament. And after the sermon, the ship heads out, and before they can even get past Nantasket, an enormous storm blows in, and they get pinned down just past Nantasket. And in fact, there is a copy of the petition hidden in a trunk on the boat, and the other passengers who had heard about that there were petitions and the worry that there might be more than one copy get very upset, and they confront the leaders of the Presbyterian group, and they say, "Are you guys carrying something on this ship that you shouldn't be?" And they say, "Yes, sorry, here's a copy of the petition." And so the other passengers throw the petition overboard, and the storm ceases, and they're able to set off. And so it's this crazy biblical story of as the story of Jonah and the whale are ringing in the ears of the passengers, they throw this petition overboard. The
storm then abates, one hopes, right?
Yeah, storm abates. The Puritans sent emissaries to England to make sure that their right to self-govern was going to be respected.
Yeah, that gets to two lessons that are often lost in sort of the casual retelling of American history. One being the Puritans or anybody early on came here in search of religious liberty, sort of widely stated, and not until the Restoration did they stop hanging religious dissidents in Boston. And then also the idea that, Thomas Jefferson wrote some flowery language and introduced the idea of self-government in July 1776, when if you go back and read anything written in Massachusetts, at least in the decade or so before the Revolution, it's clear that our charter liberties were still central. And the idea that we were a self-governing colony based on our two charters gets so lost in the revolutionary fervor.
Yeah, this leads to the story of the Dominion of New England, which you've probably maybe covered a little bit on the podcast. The Dominion of New England gets declared by the Lords of Trade. And again, I think the fact that it was the Lords of Trade who had power over the colonies is so interesting, because the British were viewing the colonies as
just a revenue generator,
as sources of natural resources to be shipped to wealth extractors, right? So they're going to govern the colonies through an economic body instead of a political one. And so the Lords of Trade, who are fed up with these non-listening colonists, sort of crybaby colonists, sets up the Dominion of New England, which is Maine and New Hampshire, Massachusetts Bay, and Plymouth, which was a separate colony then, Rhode Island, Connecticut, New York, as well as I think what was called East and West Jersey then. And the governor, The then governor of New York, Edmund Andros, gets appointed royal governor for the Dominion of New England. And he comes up to Boston because the capital of the Dominion of New England was going to be Boston. And so this is the royal authority asserting power over the New England and New York and New Jersey colonies, and doing away with the charter of the Massachusetts Bay. With the what we're called the Indian Wars threatening on the northern frontier, Andros, once he comes to power in 1686, finds himself, heading up to Maine to defend the northern border. And by the time he comes back to Boston, I think in 1689, Boston is in an absolute uproar over the royal authority over the colonies. And so it's essentially open rebellion when he comes back to Boston, and he flees, I think, to the garrison house in Fort Hill for his safety. And a group of Puritan leaders, Simon Bradstreet and I think Waite Winthrop, John Winthrop's son, and Cotton Mather, go and try to talk to Andros and say, Andros, listen, we'll assure your safety if you come out and meet with us. So Andros says, okay. And of course, being the honorable group the Puritans were, they have him arrested. And word gets out to the rest of New England, and New England militias start marching toward Boston as part of this open rebellion. Andros he's arrested, but he escapes and flees to Rhode Island, and he's captured in Rhode Island and put on a ship back to England. So this is absolute utter rebellion and essentially revolution, right?
Right. And almost to the day, it was April 18th or 19th. It was almost to the day on the pre-anniversary of the battles of Lexington and Concord, just about, 75 years, 100 years too soon. One of my favorite, it's the weirdest piece of trivia. At the Commonwealth Museum in Dorchester, there's a little display about Edmund Andros. And there's a video portraying him while he's locked up briefly before he makes his escape. And the actor who portrays him is Jim Trufrost, whose basically only other role ever was Presbalewski on the HBO show The Wire back in the early 2000s. Which,
oh yeah, right.
And he's not credited. I had to look and look. I said, I know this face, and eventually I realized, that's Presbalewski, and it's not credited. It's not on his IMDb, but it's very clearly
that is hysterical.
I hope it's still. I haven't been to the Commonwealth Museum in a few years, so I hope it's still there.
That is awesome.
But Andros didn't do a great job of ingratiating himself when he arrived here. Basically, the first thing he did was demand keys to Old South to hold an Anglican worship in a Puritan meeting house, and then he celebrated Christmas, and it did a lot of things to get off on a bad first impression with the locals.
I think he imposed taxes, which become an issue a little bit later on, generally rather autocratic. So, the New Englanders were not too thrilled with royal governance.
And, we've talked a little bit about Andros on the show in the past, but there's a chapter in Boston history that I'm not super well versed with that follows, where folks like Sir William Phipps and Increase Mather have to fight for a new charter.
Increase Mather goes to England to try to figure out what's going to follow, and it ends up compromising and agreeing to effectively a return of government based in the colonies in Massachusetts, but with concessions and with greater oversight. But Massachusetts gets to appoint its own governors and remains essentially, self-governing in so many ways. And of course, the fact that you had to take a ship to have any communication all the way to England affects that as well. Phipps is a really interesting character because he leads an expedition of Massachusetts militia to invade Quebec, which I just wait a second, Massachusetts was, I think he leads 2,000 seamen and 32 ships or something like that to lay siege on Quebec. And they get up there, and Governor General Frontenac, who the great hotel is named after, has some great quote about something like, Phipps tells them to surrender, and he says, I'm going to answer your request with the mouth of my cannons and muskets or something like that. And then, of course, it starts raining and smallpox breaks out, and the expedition is a failure.
I had read about that incident, and then I traveled to Quebec City for the first time and took one look at the terrain and said, these people were nuts. Quebec is situated on this almost impregnable cliff face high up above the St. Lawrence River. You can't invade Quebec. That's just crazy talk.
And of course, the final great battle of the French and Indian War, the Plains of Abraham, with a lot of militia from Massachusetts, the night before they scale the cliffs below Quebec, and the French guarding Quebec just think it's impossible and don't even really guard it. It's very similar to the D-Day invasion.
Once the British are up on the plains, it was all over already almost.
Yeah, was it General Wolfe and Montcalm both
died on the field.
Their wounds. And, I talk about it a little bit in the history of Boston because you have to understand the French and Indian War to understand the fundamental difference in the way the colonists and the British thought about the obligations in British North American holdings. The British thought, well, of course we're going to tax you because you should be paying for your own defense. We're defending you against those nasty French and their Native American allies, and we're going to defend you out along the Appalachian Mountains, and you should take on this burden. And the colonists were like, well, a lot of this wasn't our idea. And oh, by the way, your manpower is greatly drawn upon colonial militia. So we think we're doing our fair share. But you do have to understand that period to understand what starts happening almost immediately after the end of the French and Indian War.
Well, just to put a little bit of a bow on that, the third great invasion of Quebec was also launched out of Boston in 1775, culminating, I think it was on New Year's Day in 1776, with General Montgomery catching a bullet in the neck in Quebec, as Hamilton fans will know. It seemed like that became, for Quebecois, a great unifying moment where the British, who had been seen as maybe occupiers for a decade or so after winning sovereignty over all of Canada, were then unified with the French-speaking locals in their defense against us meddling Americans coming up from Boston under Montgomery and Arnold.
And the other thing you're bringing up here brings us back to what we were talking about early on is how do you draw the line on what's Boston history, right?
Right.
You do have to understand some of these events because they provide context to Boston. And so when you're trying to figure out how you tell Boston history, as if you and I can call ourselves historians, which one could debate, but to the extent that we role play as historians, there's constant tension, right? Context matters, but if you tell too much context, then you're no longer talking Boston history. So you do have to make these choices, and sometimes there are clear parameters, and sometimes you include it just because it's a really cool story, right?
I am very guilty of that. I like to read Boston history very widely, so I'll find excuses to, I talked about the California missions through the lens of somebody who from Boston who built a gristmill at the Mission San Bernardino, or I'll talk about, the American presence on the Oregon coast because the Columbia sailed out of Boston, because I just want to read about it.
Yeah,
have an
right?
excuse to talk about it.
Or how about the Great Halifax Explosion? Bostonians love telling the story of the Great Halifax Explosion, and because we went up and provided the relief trains.
I can almost never read that story with a dry eye, I swear. I noticed yesterday that it was the tree this year was announced yesterday, and I immediately get choked up reading about the family who has decorated this tree every year for 40 years, but now it's too big, so they hope we enjoy it as much as they do. And thanks for the help after the explosion. Ugh, how can you not be affected by that?
It's a tremendous tragedy, but it's also a story of incredible effort by in Massachusetts sending the relief up, and the continuing story with the Christmas tree. And so we continue to tell it in Boston because it's such a compelling story, but it's not really Boston history. I mean, we're related to it, and Bostonians play a role in it. But so you have to draw those, you have to make those choices. And I think everyone says Great Halifax Explosion makes the cut for Boston. Because it is just, because it is such a good story. But those are the types of things that we decide to include or not include.
So something like the Great Halifax Explosion, that's during World War I. It's basically a result of munitions ships not being careful enough in Halifax Harbor. when I read through the watershed moments in your book, that's a moment when Boston, maybe it's not in full decline, but it's slipping at least. So what does it tell us about Boston, or maybe just about history more broadly, that, one of these eras that you've called out as being Boston on the downslope? It's also a moment when Boston has the resources and the people and the wherewithal to put this relief expedition, not only to put a train together the next day and provide the first relief, but to provide ongoing relief for months and years afterwards.
You try to come up with these neat time periods. So I end my section on sort of the triumph of 19th century Boston, which I have going up to 1920, but I end it with the Great Halifax Explosion story because I think it's like Boston at its absolute finest. But then when I start the discussion of the 20th century, which is now 20 years in, I then start a little bit before 1917 with all the, fear of immigrants, with the anarchists and the bombings that are going on, and this real terror that's happening, as well as, these slum areas, the immigrant neighborhoods on the waterfront, where it's seen as a big sort of health crisis and fear of fire. And so Bostonians then, you get in 1920 this very deep national deflationary recession. And when you have deflation, people put off spending decisions. If you can, if you're thinking about buying something today, well, just wait a month and you can buy it more cheaply. And so people stop spending. And the mills of New England respond to this deflationary recession by looking for lower cost labor and relocating to the American South and overseas. And it starts the decline of our manufacturing base. And the way we respond to this crisis is we start doing things that, each decision in and of itself, has its defenders, but you put them all together, essentially destroys the city, right? And so 1924, two things happen that end up having enormous effects to the history of Boston. One is the Immigration Act of 1924, which effectively ends the immigrant era of Boston, where Boston was continually being refreshed by new people coming to the city with new ideas, who start businesses, who, leads to a lot of innovation. And, the Immigration Act is the product of 2 decades of fighting by Senator Henry Cabot Lodge to impose immigration restrictions. And he gets his backing from the Immigration Restriction League, founded by, I think 3 Harvard alums on Beacon Hill, Brahmins, who are trying to end immigration into Boston. And also in 1924 is the first zoning act in Boston, which essentially makes illegal the neighborhoods of Boston that we love the most, right? So the Back Bay and the North End and Charlestown and the South End, all of these neighborhoods become effectively illegal when Boston adopts zoning. And zoning, everyone, who's against zoning? Zoning's like, apple pie, right? Like everyone's in favor of zoning. And the arguments for zoning all made complete sense in 1924, and no one questions it today. It's about separating uses and separating buildings. Yep.
Yeah, I was going to say, expand a little bit on what you mean by the neighborhoods that people love the best. What makes people love those neighborhoods like Charlestown, the North End, and then what becomes illegal with zoning at that point?
The concern of the reform advocates, which has various names, the Garden City movement is generally the name mostly given for it, comes out of Europe, and it's supposed to address these crises of urban slums. And urban slums had some real problems, right? They were centers for disease. There were fires that often spread. They were high crime areas, and they tended to be polluted because they were often located next to industry, right? And so reformers look at these slum areas and say, how do we respond to the slums? And the notion of the Garden City movement was essentially, let's bring the suburbs to the city. Let's separate where people work from where people live. And let's separate buildings. Let's have lots of air and open space around buildings. Let's have parks around buildings. And so the idea was to isolate buildings from other buildings and from other uses, and have lots of space between them, right? And as a result of that, disease doesn't spread between buildings because you have lots of space, and fire doesn't spread between buildings, and you don't get crime because crime tends to flourish in dark and dark places where people can hide. But when you have lots of separation of buildings, there'd be no place to hide, and they're less polluted because we've moved industry away from where people live.
Well, that all sounds great. What could possibly be wrong
It
with
does,
that?
right? So the best of intentions, right? Except that's just not what cities are, right? And the better response to those things would have been crime reform and public health
Disease
initiatives
control. Yeah,
and
exactly.
more fire prevention measures, instead of essentially destroying what makes cities what they are, which is people can walk to where they live to where they work, and dense neighborhoods makes housing much more affordable because you can fit many more people there, and people interact with each other, and we've learned through history and social science research that innovation happens when lots of people from different backgrounds come together and exchange ideas. And so what I mean by making them illegal is that immediately upon the adoption of zoning, all of the properties in those neighborhoods became non-conforming with zoning. And so as soon as zoning was adopted in Boston, and through today, if you had an open area of land and you said, I love the North End more than any other neighborhood, let's build a new North End, you couldn't do it. It would not be allowed. And it's kind of crazy that the neighborhoods that if you asked any Bostonian what neighborhoods they love the most, they would all name those neighborhoods. And even if they named a neighborhood like Dorchester as their favorite, that doesn't comply either. The triple deckers do not comply with zoning. And in fact, there was a great effort to outlaw triple deckers, which ends up passing. And the triple deckers had been a form of inexpensive housing for immigrants, in some ways to move out of what were called the slums, but were actually very dense and vital neighborhoods.
Anytime I've dealt with some of these questions on the podcast, it's been the effect. It's been a few decades later, the slum clearance of urban renewal, the flattening of the West End, the New York streets, the so many great neighborhoods that just don't really exist in Boston anymore because of sort of the mid-century urban policy. Yeah, we knocked them all down.
Federal and local policy.
Right.
Federal money, but local policy.
I never thought quite as much about some of the causes that created that situation. It's revealing to have the conversation.
Until the 1960s, no one questioned urban renewal, right? We tore down the New York streets and the West End and Scully Square, and no one objected, right? Like, it was just what you did. We had these city problems. People were moving out of the city, so let's tear them down and start from scratch. But we tore down dense, diverse neighborhoods and replaced them with low density and non-diverse neighborhoods.
I mean, some people did object, but it was the people who lived in those neighborhoods who had very limited political power, and nobody was listening to them.
Yes, and by the 1960s.
Right.
But in the 1940s and 1950s, there was much less of it, in part because, the promise was made that new housing was going to be built for the people who were being displaced, which, of course, turned out to be a lie. And once that was figured out, then you get Charlestown and Allston and Brighton rebelling against the urban renewal. And it's the beginning of this process of sort of a people's rebellion that starts in the 1960s. It leads to by the 1970s opposition to the urban ring and the Southwest Expressway, which don't get built, which are great triumphs of urbanism over bad urban policy. But then we learned the lessons too well, and today we're now opposed to everything, and it's one of the major contributors to the housing crisis we're in is that we can't build anything new.
Selfishly, I'm glad the Southwest Expressway didn't happen, because depending on which era's plans you look at, it would be basically right through my backyard here in Hyde Park, within a block.
I don't think it's anything selfish. It would have been an absolute catastrophe for the city. I mean, to build that in the urban ring was just destroying the city. I mean, people forget with these highway. We talk about losing neighborhoods through urban renewal when we tore down the West End and New York streets and Scully Square, and later we tore down a lot of the South End and Charlestown. But these highways displaced almost as many people as urban renewal. You look at the central artery, and there were thousands of people who lost their job, lost their homes, and businesses that went out of business. People lost their jobs. And so the way the central artery was built was block by block, right? They didn't do eminent domain of the entire stretch all at one time. They would do eminent domain of a block and then build the highway would march south. It was built from north to south. So the central artery was being built marching south, and the eminent domain was just staying just ahead of the highway construction. And so the people of Chinatown could see this highway coming toward them, right? Like a slow moving tsunami. And Chinatown, which had always lacked political power, comes together to oppose the eminent domain and the highway going through their neighborhood. And miraculously, their petitioning, what they argued for was to put the Central Artery underground, a tunnel through Chinatown. And incredibly, they get the government to agree that instead of the Central Artery being above ground the way it is everywhere else, it's going to dip underground at Chinatown and then reemerge to the south of Chinatown. And so it was like, yay, what a great triumph. And then the government said, well, F you. We're going to still take eminent domain, and the way we're going to build the tunnel is through cut and cover. And so Chinatown still gets separated, and you can see it today. Today it's part of the Greenway. But you can still see this great swath that separates the Leather District from Chinatown, which before the Central Artery was all part of the same urban neighborhood. So even though the Central Artery went underground there still was this great scar that cut right through Chinatown.
There's a great book just in the last couple of years by Michael Liu, Forever Struggle, which is based around political organizing in Boston's Chinatown and how much of it comes out of resistance to the Central Artery project.
I haven't read the book, but that's right.
I tried so hard to get Michael to come on the show, and we couldn't make it happen, but it's a great book. Anybody should read it. Forever Struggle, Michael Liu, all about Chinatown.
All right, I have to find that.
But that raises a question for me, which I should have asked earlier. As an attorney, as not a professional historian, not somebody with a PhD, how do you research this book?
For me, it was storytelling, and my approach to doing the research and writing, I think, was different from the way a lot of people write history, which is often written chronologically, and the book ends up being roughly chronological, although I pick up different threads and carry them forward and then loop back to a different thread. So it's not perfectly chronological, but I didn't write it in that order. I wrote it in whatever order of things that I was reading at the time, and I used mostly secondary sources. So because I wanted to learn the history of Boston, I was just trying to find as many books about Boston history as I could. And I ended up, mostly buying 265 books on some aspect of Boston history. And over a period of 4 years, I read every book that I cite in the bibliography. I read cover to cover and took notes on. And so the discipline was I tried to read one book a week for 4 years, take notes on it, and then weave it into the narrative. And so, since I didn't read the books in chronological order, it was kind of like a jigsaw puzzle. So I would take notes in different periods and try to figure out how to tie them together. And then as the manuscript was coming together, I would just, in bold in the manuscript, I would just make notes to myself, what happened next? Why did this happen? And then I try to find books as well as newspaper articles and magazine articles and journal stories, as well as, I tried to approach this as if I were a tourist and just had innumerable questions. And so I visited, I think, over 70 historic sites and museums. And I was, as I said, like with your podcast, taking notes. I would bring a notepad and pen, and I would go, do the Freedom Trail tour. I would go to a historic house and take the historic house tour, the Gibson House, the Nichols House, and ask questions and take notes, like as a tourist. And then, I would take those notes home and type them into my manuscript and try to move things around and get it into some kind of cohesive narrative and cohesive order. And so, I'm pleased with how it all filled together. I have to say that I started in December of 2017, and by early 2020, I was a little panicked that I was like, I think I've taken on too much. And then March 2020 happened, and I just had hours and hours more time available than I had before and after the pandemic.
Along with the research you had to do, reading, what did you say, 263 books, something like that?
5 or something like that.
Yeah, something along those lines.
It's about that.
I will say I'm lucky that, authors send me books when they want to talk to me. I don't have to go out and buy them most of the time. So along with your book budget, some of the research had to involve the visual aspect of the book. The book, like a lot of history books these days, richly illustrated with historical maps, paintings, iconic photos like the soiling of Old Glory. But it also has a lot of new, original, modern photos that help set it apart.
So I finished the manuscript with no images and knew that I needed to figure out how to do images. And so I was familiar with a photographer named Peter Vanderwerker, who is probably the most well-known and greatest of all urban photographers based in Boston. I put it that way because he takes pictures outside of Boston as well. But one of Boston's great photographers of the last 40 years. He's really brilliant, and he's got a number of books which I own and had cited. And a mutual friend of ours introduced us. We went out to dinner together at a Chinese restaurant and had a few Mai Tais. And I brought the manuscript with me. I had no notion that he was actually going to work with me on this project, but I just, I gave him the manuscript and just said, here you go, you're welcome to it. And his wife later told me that he has ADHD and never reads, but he sat down and read the manuscript cover to cover in like 3 days. And he called me up afterwards and said that he loved the manuscript and believed in the project so much that he was going to make his entire 40-year archive of photos of Boston available to me if I would put his name on the cover. And it took me all of 1 second to say, absolutely. I get 40 years of phenomenal images of Boston. And by putting your name on the cover, you help the brand because you actually have brand recognition in a way that I don't. So it was an absolute no-brainer to me, and it was really, really fun working with him. And then, I think it was important also to have historical images and maps and the like. And so I worked with a photo researcher to track down images, and ones that are in the public domain, then they're free. And if they're more recent, then we'd have to pay for them. So like the soiling of Old Glory, I just had to have because it's the most iconic of all Boston photographs. Similarly, the Bobby Orr flying through the air, it was either that or Carlton Fisk's home run that I thought were the two most iconic Boston sports images, because I have about 50 pages of Boston sports history. And I found out what the cost was to buy those two, and they were both really, really expensive. So I said, it's got to be one or the other. And I decided to go with Bobby Orr over Carlton Fisk. I wish I had both of them, but you have to make some choices.
So picking up a thread from our earlier conversation, the last of the watershed moments, so the last of the known watershed moments, at least, in your book is Boston Resurgent. Do you feel like the return to urbanism was as planned and deliberate as the attempt to suburbanize Boston a generation before?
No. I sort of, again, neatly package it into what I call the 3Ds, density, diversity, and good urban design. That when cities embrace those principles, they do well. And when cities reject those principles, as Boston did through much of the 20th century, they decline. And Boston sort of just started re-embracing those principles in the 1990s as people came back to the city. But again, nothing is as neat, right? So what else is going on that's contemporaneous with the return of people to the city? Street crime and organized crime and public corruption all declined significantly in the 1990s for a bunch of reasons, some having to do with the economy and federal policy, some with local policing, some with the fact that the Menino administration was relatively clean, the grip of Whitey Bulger becomes loosened in the 1990s. And so the problem with that type of crime is that investment in the city flees. So crime has really two victims, the direct victim, but then the victim of entire communities when investment flees the city. And so the loosening of the grip of crime ends up being a major factor to people returning to the city. The environment, right? We finally start cleaning up the environment. Goes back to the 1970s, but really not till the harbor is cleaned up and the Charles River cleaned up by the 1990s. Does it just become a cleaner and healthier place to live? The big dig. I don't want to underestimate the importance of the big dig. So a whole bunch of factors all come together by the 1990s, as well as a greater recognition, certainly by companies, of the importance of locating in ecosystems where there's lots of other companies and lots of other people around. The lesson of the Massachusetts Miracle from the 1970s and 1980s was those were companies that all had a really good idea, mostly around the personal computer, and they located in isolated suburban campuses away from other people. And so they were able to innovate a single time. But with the rise of Silicon Valley and the internet in the 1990s, those Massachusetts Miracle companies were not being isolated, were not able to innovate a second time. And all of the Massachusetts Miracle companies are out of business today. And so the lessons that companies learned in business was you can't be isolated, or at least when you are isolated from lots of other people, it's much harder to continue to innovate. And so there was a real embracing of the benefits of locating around other people. And it gives rise to the great triumph of Kendall Square and then the Seaport. And so all of those things come together to lead to a resurgence in Boston and get played out in cities around the country and around the world. I mean, we're sort of in this great period of people returning to the city internationally as well.
I first moved to Boston in 1997, so I've really only known Boston in its ascendancy. You now have a perspective that's at least 400 years old, if not several million years old, going back to the formation of the continents. When you step back and look, do you feel like Boston is on the rise? Are we entering another period of decline? What do you think the health of the city is right now?
The last chapter of the book I can't call it a watershed moment yet because we don't know, but I asked the question, are we at another watershed moment? We've had this great 30-year run, but are we pivoting to something that's a little bit more worrisome? And it's hard to answer that question, but I guess I have two thoughts on it. Number one, I'm really worried about the future of the city because of the great crises we face today in terms of housing affordability. There's a real transportation crisis about moving people around the city. We have a climate change crisis. Depending on how you measure it, there's lots of reports that say Boston is really one of the top 10 most exposed cities in the world for rising sea level, that we have so much of our infrastructure is susceptible to flooding. And so that could, you see the flood maps going out to 2050 or 2070. And it's really scary for the future of Boston.
I have a good friend who works for the MWRA in a pumping station, essentially. Well, he did work for the MWRA in a pumping station. And it doesn't take much rain to flood some parts of the city with the machinery all doesn't work perfectly at every moment. So sea level rise, we don't even need sea level rise. We just need a rainy weekend.
The subway system is totally exposed as well as lots of other systems. The more immediate crisis we're facing now with remote work, and that with people not coming back to the office, a disproportionate amount of the city's tax revenue comes from taxes on, comes from property taxes disproportionately on commercial buildings, particularly office buildings. And as current leases come up for renewal over the next couple of years, companies are going to be taking less space, and we're going to see an enormous amount of vacancy in Boston's office buildings. And you can bet the owners of all those buildings are going to be, bringing abatement petitions, and we could see an enormous amount of loss of revenue for the city of Boston. So there's lots of reasons I'm very concerned, and I'm not sure that we have the political will. I'm not blaming individual politicians. I think individual politicians all have the best of thoughts, but there's some real structural limitations on our ability to politically deal with these crises that we face today. The way we do our land use planning, it's going to be very, very difficult to change that, unfortunately. And so I have a lot of worry for the future of Boston. On the other hand, I'm really not worried that we're going to go back to the Boston from the 1920s to the 1980s. I think you could see a rise in crime, but I don't think you're going to see crime the way it was before with organized crime. We're not going to see pollution reach the levels that it was at before. And we're not going to see these policies of just tearing down neighborhoods the way we did before. And companies also, as I mentioned, embrace the benefits of urbanism, that I think we recognize now that innovation occurs best in cities. And I don't think we're going to lose that. So I have reasons to be generally optimistic about the importance of cities and reasons to be pessimistic about the political will to
actually address those
ability
challenges.
To solve some of the challenges we have today. Yeah.
For somebody who has never really thought about what makes a great city, I was going to say a great American city, but any city, or what makes a city thrive or wither, what do you think some of the most important lessons somebody who's approaching this topic with fresh eyes can take from your book?
I try to establish this notion of the importance of density and diversity and good urban design to city building. And what I mean by that is cities are successful when they create those spaces, and this is the design or architecture aspect of it. And what's sometimes called social infrastructure. There's a influential professor at NYU, Eric Kliningberg, who talks about social infrastructure is those spaces today that sort of replace the agora from ancient Greece or the forum from ancient Rome, right? What are those spaces that we create where you can bring lots of people together today from diverse backgrounds, from lots of different backgrounds, and it's racial diversity, but it's Jane Jacobs talked about the importance of diversity in age groups, right? Having neighborhoods with older people who are sort of neighborhood watch people, as well as young people who bring vitality and new ideas, right? And so mixes of age, mixes of different experiences, and when you bring all those things together, you get innovation and you get vital cities. And I think that we just can't forget that, because we did we knew it in the 19th century intuitively, even if there wasn't social science research. We totally forgot it in the 20th century, and there's a recognition today. Vital cities, it's so important for vital cities.
Well, as I get ready to wrap up here today, is there anything that I haven't asked that you wish I had asked you today?
There are so many good stories. My favorite story is about the civil rights movement in Boston in the 1840s, which I find so fascinating. In the case of Roberts versus Boston School Committee, which is my favorite, as a lawyer, that's my favorite legal case in Boston history, because it ends up providing the legal justification for Jim Crow. Plessy v. Ferguson cites Roberts versus Boston School Committee's justification for it. And then fast forward to 1954, and Thurgood Marshall is looking for plaintiffs to bring a challenge to segregated schools. And the challenge he had is he had lots of potential plaintiffs from the Deep South, where the schools were incredibly unequal. But he didn't want the lead plaintiffs in Brown v. Board of what became Brown v. Board of Education to be from highly unequal schools, because he was worried that the Supreme Court could affirm Plessy v. Ferguson, the separate but equal doctrine.
If they were truly equal schools, then it was more defensible. Interesting.
He needed the lead case to be from essentially equal schools, so that if they're going to, he needed that in order to strike down Plessy v. Ferguson. He makes his argument based on the arguments that Charles Sumner had made, and the losing side in Roberts v. Boston School Committee, which is that separate is inherently unequal. And so the Roberts versus Boston School Committee ends up being the legal justification for both Jim Crow, which was the winning side in Roberts versus Boston School Committee, as well as the Sumner argument. The losing side in Roberts versus School Committee becomes the legal justification for Brown v. Board of Education. And then fast forward to more recently with the Goodrich decision, which legalized same-sex marriage in Massachusetts. As a reaction to the Supreme Judicial Court's decision in Goodrich, Governor Romney and the General Court wanted to see if they could come up with civil unions as an alternative to gay marriage. And so the General Court sent a petition to the Supreme Judicial Court. The General Court, being the state legislature, sends a petition to the Supreme Judicial Court asking the question of whether or not they could adopt civil union as an alternative to the Goodrich decision of gay marriage. And the Supreme Judicial Court, while it doesn't cite Roberts versus Boston School Committee, goes back to the Sumner argument that separate is inherently unequal, in saying that civil unions was not an alternative to gay marriage. So this one case ends up being not only the justification for the end of Jim Crow in the United States, but becomes a sort of the foundation for what solidifies the right to gay marriage in Massachusetts, which then, of course, becomes the law, everywhere in the United States eventually.
Well, I'm glad we had a chance to touch on the Roberts decision, the long-reaching legal influence it had. Now, Dan, I know you're in the midst of a flurry of book events. So if listeners have heard this conversation today and they're excited, they want to come out and meet you, learn more about the book, maybe get a copy signed, where should they go for information?
So because I'm not like a full-time author and instead I'm a lawyer, I've worked with our firm's marketing person to have a page on our law firm's website with information about the book and book events. DainTorpy.com is our law firm website. And if you go to that website, there's a page, a link to A History of Boston, the name of my book, which has some book reviews. The reviews have been really great. I've been excited about the book reviews as well as upcoming events. I think I've now done about 45 book talks and interviews, but this one remains, this one has become, I think, both the longest and one of my favorites because the person asking me questions today, you, Jake, actually knows Boston history incredibly well. And so
I blush.
Really I blush. Yeah, a whole bunch of events coming up. November 20th, I'm at the Quinn. That's a private event, but for anyone who's a member of the Quinn, you can come out to that. But you'll see there's a whole bunch of other ones. Massachusetts Historical Society in January, West End Museum also in January, Needham History Museum in February. So people who are interested in hearing more about my take on the history of Boston, definitely come to some of these public events.
Well, I will put in an extra plug for your event in January at the West End Museum because I feel like that's a very under-visited museum that has a lot to offer. Dan, I just want to say thank you very much for joining us today. The book, again, is A History of Boston by Daniel Dain, and it's available in bookstores everywhere right now.
Thank you very much. It's been a great pleasure being on. I had a total blast tonight.
To learn more about Daniel Dain and his new book, A History of Boston, check out this week's show notes at hubhistory.com/288. We'll have a link to Dan's author page where you can find out more about him and see the list of his many, many upcoming book events in the Boston area. And of course, I'll include a link where you can support the show and independent bookstores by buying Dan's book. If you'd like to get in touch with me, you can email podcast@hubhistory.com. We are Hub History on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram, and most active on Twitter. If you're on Mastodon, you can find me as @hubhistory@better.boston. Or just go to hubhistory.com and click on the Contact Us link. While you're on the site, hit the subscribe link and be sure that you never miss an episode. If you subscribe on Apple Podcasts, please consider writing us a brief review. If you do, drop me a line, and I'll send you a Hub History sticker as a token of appreciation. That's all for now. Stay safe out there, listeners.